speaking with Captain Gustavo Valencia, and this ship is under Ecliptic control.
Somewhere out in the Jaffa system, far from the jurisdiction of anyone who might care, a group of people built a life inside what was left after the world moved on. They didn't build it the way New Atlantis was built, with surveys and charters and long speeches about the promise of humanity's future. They didn't build it the way Neon was built, with a corporation's cold-eyed calculation of what people are willing to pay for and what margin the seller can extract. They built it the way anything gets built, when there's no one watching, and no contract to honor, and no charter to uphold. Piece by piece, out of whatever survived the original wreck. Old walls repurposed, old weapons cleaned and kept loaded, old hierarchies dissolved and replaced with something harder and more honest. The people at Vulture's Roost didn't inherit a civilization. They moved into the space it left behind. That framing matters because the easy story about a place like this is the one civilization has always told about its edges. That outlaws are just failures, that scavengers are just people who couldn't compete, that lawless outposts exist because some human beings are simply incapable of a better life. It's a comfortable story. It keeps the center looking clean. It allows New Atlantis to walk its white corridors without accounting for what those corridors required, what they displaced, what they produced, and then quietly forgot about. The outpost on Jaffa 4 can be filed away as evidence of human weakness rather than examined as evidence of something more systemic and harder to dismiss. But what if the scavengers aren't the failure? What if they're the consequence? Vulture's Roost sits on the surface of Jaffa 4, the fourth planet from the Sun in a system that recommends itself to no one in particular. It has no natural resources the settled worlds desperately need, no famous landmarks, no UC administrative hub, no Freestar colonial investment. Jaffa is the kind of system you pass through on the way to somewhere more important, notable primarily for its proximity to other things. South of Crix, east of Alpha Centauri, sitting adjacent to the Porrima system where Paradiso floats in comfortable orbit, selling expensive views to people who can afford to stop looking at the galaxy and simply enjoy it. Jaffa 4 offers no such luxury. What it offers is distance. What it offers is the particular freedom that comes from being too inconvenient, too unremarkable, too remote for the major powers to bother claiming. That kind of distance is its own resource. It doesn't appear on mining surveys or resource assessments. You can't bottle it and sell it at a neon trading post or list it in a UC commercial registry. But for the people who needed it, who were looking for a place where their past wouldn't follow them, or where they could conduct their business without acquiring the wrong kind of attention, or who had simply been left in a distant system when the work that brought them there concluded and no one organized the trip home. The distance of Jaffa 4 was precisely what the location was worth. This is not an accident of geography. It is, in a specific and meaningful sense, why the place exists where it does. The name is worth thinking about before anything else. Names in the settled worlds tend to be aspirational. New Atlantis reaches toward a mythology of recovered golden ages. Paradiso promises the view from paradise. Even Neon, for all its honest appetite, names itself after light. These are places marketing themselves to the future, to the idea of what could be built in the stars if human ambition extended itself far enough in the right direction. Vulture's Roost names itself after what circles the dead. That's not cynicism, or rather, it's not only cynicism, it's also a kind of precision, an acknowledgement of the relationship between this place and the things that made it possible. The Vulture doesn't pretend to be something else. It doesn't call itself an eagle or a phoenix. It recognizes, with a clarity that more aspirationally named places lack, exactly what its relationship to the landscape is. It arrives after the killing is done. It feeds on what was left behind. And in the settled systems of 2330, in the long aftermath of a war that produced an enormous quantity of exactly the kind of surplus that a scavenger economy requires, there is a specific honesty in that name that its more grandly titled neighbors cannot claim. And into that distance moved Ecliptic. Not as refugees, not originally anyway, not as people fleeing something, though there are certainly those in the mix. Ecliptic arrived in places like Jaffa 4 as the long arm of a civilization that needed reach. It couldn't officially extend, the subcontracted muscle of a political order too large and too self-conscious about its own legitimacy to do its dirtier work in its own name. What they built at Vulture's Roost tells a story about what happens when that arm stops being controlled, about what it costs a society when it subcontracts its violence for long enough that the violence eventually stops coming home, stops pretending to belong to anyone, stops accepting the conditions under which it was originally deployed. The story of how a respected military contracting organization becomes the occupying force of a lawless stronghold is the story of this place. And what makes it worth telling slowly, worth following from its beginning to its current shape, is that it doesn't turn on any single act of betrayal or any obvious moment of corruption. It turns on something more mundane and more difficult, on the slow accumulation of small decisions made by organizations and governments who all believed at each individual step that they were managing an acceptable compromise. The central question here isn't whether Vulture's Roost is good or bad. That question belongs to a different kind of story, a simpler one, with cleaner lines and a more satisfying resolution. The question that makes this place worth sitting with is something more unsettling. When an organization built to uphold civilization decides civilization no longer applies to it, what exactly does it become? And what does its existence tell us about what civilization actually was? To understand what Vulture's Roost is, you have to understand what Ecliptic used to be, which means understanding the particular problem that made them necessary in the first place, and why that problem had no clean solution. The settled systems are large. That's not primarily a geographical observation, though it's that too. It's a political observation, one about the fundamental mismatch between the scale of what the United Colonies and the Freestar Collective claim to govern and the scale of what they can practically administer. Between them, the two dominant powers of human space have staked authority over a remarkable stretch of colonized worlds, orbital stations, transit corridors, and far-flung outposts spread across dozens of star systems. The ideological positions are clear. The UC operates as a formal meritocratic republic, with its bureaucratic apparatus and its fleet, projecting authority outward from New Atlantis. The Freestar Collective positions itself as the defender of individual freedoms against exactly that kind of centralized control. They disagree about almost everything except the territory they're arguing over. And that territory, in its full extent, is simply beyond the practical capacity of either power to hold in any meaningful sense. The mathematics of maintaining real order across dozens of systems quickly outruns the capacity of any centralized military force to deliver it. There are corners of the settled systems, frontier planets, abandoned relay stations, disputed moons, installations that were built during earlier phases of expansion and then outgrown or simply forgotten, where the UC fleet has no practical presence, where the Freestar Rangers are too thinly stretched to respond in anything close to useful time, where the closest thing to authority is whoever arrived with the most guns and the most confidence. Into this gap, Ecliptic entered. At their founding and for many years afterward, they were what their reputation promised: a highly regarded military contracting organization, trusted by both the UC and the Freestar Collective, with the kind of work that needed doing in the distant corners of the systems where neither power could easily deploy their own forces. Peacekeeping operations, stabilization contracts, security provision for installations that couldn't wait months for an official response to distant trouble. The work was legitimate in the sense that its purposes were holding the thin frontier of order against the natural entropy that gathers wherever central authority can't reach, keeping the distant edges of human space from collapsing entirely into chaos before the settled powers could consolidate their claims. This is worth dwelling on because it complicates the simple outlaw portrait. Ecliptic, at their height, were not criminals. They were the people the law sent ahead of itself. In a precise and meaningful sense, they were civilization's advance scouts, the force that went where official power couldn't yet go, to hold space until something more permanent could be established. The UC paid them. The Freestar Collective paid them. Both understood that a stable, functioning, settled systems required the kind of flexible, deployable, politically deniable force that a private contractor could provide and a government could not, because a government's actions are official, and official actions carry consequences that deniable ones do not. That relationship between the two great powers and the organization they'd tasked with their least officially speakable work contained, from the beginning, a structural problem that took years to fully unfold. The problem was accountability, and it was baked into the original arrangement. When you send an armed organization into distant places with nominal authority to enforce laws and maintain order, and when the official powers backing them are too far away to supervise closely, and when the work itself happens in the environments where there are no witnesses except the people being policed, you have created something that can redefine its own mandate whenever it finds it convenient. The check on that redefinition is supposed to be consequence, the threat of losing contracts, of official condemnation, of force used against you rather than alongside you. But consequence requires attention. It requires that the people in a position to apply it actually care enough to do so. And the United Colonies and the Freestar Collective, whatever their profound differences in political philosophy, share one characteristic that made consequence slow to arrive. They both still needed the work done. The frontier doesn't wait. The distant installations don't stop needing security because one contractor has started abusing their position. The political bandwidth required to prosecute an organization the size of Ecliptic, to litigate the contracts, to absorb the operational gap their absence would create, to manage the optics of publicly disavowing an organization you'd been publicly praising for decades, is enormous. Far easier to manage the problem quietly, to negotiate boundaries behind closed doors, to apply soft pressure while continuing to benefit from the services on offer. The math of necessity kept Ecliptic operational long after it had stopped deserving to be. And Ecliptic, being a sophisticated organization with sophisticated leadership, understood that math as well as anyone. Their position was secure so long as they remained useful. And they could remain useful while simultaneously expanding far beyond what their original mandate had ever contemplated. So they expanded. They accumulated resources in the far-flung installations they'd been deployed to stabilize, skimming from the systems they managed in ways too subtle for distant overseers to easily detect. They entrenched in the frontier outposts they'd been sent to secure, making themselves harder to remove with every passing year. They built supply chains, communication networks, informal alliances with the other organizations operating at the margins of official civilization. And somewhere in the space between legitimate contractor and functional warlord, they crossed a line that looked different in retrospect than it did in the moment. Not a single dramatic line, but a gradient, crossed so gradually that no one involved could point to the exact place where the transformation completed itself. By the time Ecliptic began using its nominal authority to extort money from the people it had been paid to protect, turning the language of peacekeeping into the mechanism of extraction, the organization was already too embedded, too distributed, too practically necessary to the settled powers for either of them to seriously consider excising it. The condemnation came. Even the Crimson Fleet, not known for its principled positions, turned against them. But condemnation without consequence is just noise, and Ecliptic had been operating in environments full of noise for long enough to know the difference between noise and a real threat. The colony war changed everything, the way large conflicts always do, not by introducing new problems, but by accelerating the ones that already existed and producing, in the wreckage of its conclusion, exactly the kind of opportunity that an organization like Ecliptic was uniquely positioned to exploit. The war between the United Colonies and the Free Star Collective ran from 2308 to 2311, sparked by a dispute over whether a Free Star farming settlement on Vesta constituted a colony in violation of the Treaty of Narion, a question both sides answered differently, and neither was willing to leave unanswered diplomatically. Its prosecution was brutal, and its conclusion at the Battle of Cheyenne, where Free Star civilian ships broke the UC Navy's advance on Aquila, left the Free Star Collective with something approaching a military victory, but neither side with anything approaching peace. The armistice that followed imposed restrictions on both powers, banned mechs and xenoweapons, and produced the tense, exhausted stability that passes for order when two forces are too depleted to fight again, but too ideologically opposed to reconcile. The border remained. the disagreements remained. What changed was the physical landscape of the systems in between and the status of all the infrastructure that the war had rendered temporarily unnecessary and then simply abandoned. Wars produce vacancy. This is one of their least examined effects. The way large-scale conflict not only destroys what's directly targeted, but leaves behind an enormous quantity of infrastructure that served military or wartime purposes and has no clear owner in the peace that follows. Outposts that had been staging grounds and were now decommissioned. Research and manufacturing facilities whose supply chains had been severed and whose original corporate owners had folded or been absorbed. Star-yard installations drifting in systems that were no longer strategically relevant to either power, their crews long evacuated, their equipment slowly degrading in the absence of maintenance. But infrastructure isn't the only thing wars leave behind. They leave people, too, in the same condition, people whose purpose was wartime and whose skills were built around wartime, and who discover, when the fighting ends, that the peace doesn't have a clear role for them, and that the organization that trained them and deployed them isn't particularly concerned with what they do next. The colony war produced, in the systems most affected by its fighting, entire communities of economically displaced people. Former soldiers demobilized faster than civilian economies could absorb them. Families uprooted from frontier settlements caught in contested zones. Contract workers whose employers had gone under in the financial chaos that tends to accompany large conflicts, and the category that never gets its own official name, the people who were simply in the wrong place, doing whatever work was available in systems that became a battlefield, and who emerged from the conflict technically alive, but stripped of everything that had constituted their life before it began. The war produced, in other words, a landscape of vacancy, and vacancy in the settled systems, as in every human society before it, tends to be filled. Ecliptic understood this opportunity with unusual clarity. They were, in some ways, perfectly suited to recognize it. An organization that had been operating in the frontier for years, that knew where the abandoned places were, that had the logistical capacity to move into and maintain them, and that had the necessary indifference to legal formality to act on that knowledge without waiting for anyone's permission. Given that Ecliptic had historically accepted contracts from both the UC and the Freestar Collective, it's reasonable to assume they navigated the war's margins with the same transactional flexibility, watching the conflict closely, positioning themselves for whatever came after. And as the fighting wound down and the shape of its aftermath became legible, they began a systematic process of territorial expansion into the ruins. What made this possible, and what made it practically unchallengeable, was a document that clarified the legal ambiguity in terms favorable to exactly the kind of operation Ecliptic intended to run. The Ecliptic Communique, a priority message sent by a commander known as Creek to all Ecliptic personnel, conveyed what the organization had apparently been testing through informal channels, that both the Freestar Collective and the United Colonies had confirmed, however quietly, that facilities abandoned during the Colony War were considered fair game. The precise meaning of that phrase was open to interpretation. Ecliptic chose the most expansive interpretation available. The message is worth reading as a historical artifact because it reveals not just what Ecliptic planned to do, but how the organization understood its own position. It is not the language of people who believe they're breaking rules. It is the language of people who have had a conversation, received a confirmation, and are now acting on that confirmation with the confidence of an organization that believes, not without reason, that the major powers are too compromised by their own past use of Ecliptic to object loudly to what Ecliptic does next. The vacancy of the colony war ruins wasn't just physical, it was legal, institutional, moral, and into that vacancy, Ecliptic moved with the deliberateness of an organization that had been waiting for exactly this moment. What they built inside those ruins was not a society in any ideological sense. It was not a declaration of independence or a manifesto of alternative values. It was something more pragmatic than that. A series of functional habitations organized around the needs of a semi-permanent military force that had decided with admirable honesty that it was no longer working for anyone but itself. They took the physical infrastructure of the old world, the walls, the airlocks, the power systems, the landing pads, and installed themselves inside it, along with everything the new life required. The scavenging wasn't incidental to this project. It was its founding principle. The entire model depended on the surplus that war produces, on the fact that destruction at scale always leaves behind more usable material than anyone bothers to recover, more than anyone with legitimate standing ever cares enough to claim. By 2033, when the events of Starfield unfold, this process has been running for nearly 2 decades. Ecliptic has graduated from contractor to something more difficult to categorize, too organized and too purposeful for the word outlaw, too violent and too self-serving for anything like the word independent. They will work for anyone who can pay. The UC still employs them when deniability is more useful than official force. Their deployment against the Crimson Fleet through UC system defense is one instance where this arrangement surfaced into something like the official record. Whether the Freestar Collective has made similar use of them is harder to confirm, though the logic of the relationship suggests the temptation exists on both sides. Even in the knowledge that Ecliptic has been abusing its nominal authority, both major powers have been reluctant to act because the need the organization fills has never gone away. What they've built is not an alternative to civilization. It's civilization's subcontracted machinery, still running on the original logic, now answerable only to whoever happens to be holding the current contract. Vulture's Roost is what that machinery looks like from the inside. Landing on Jaffa 4, what strikes you first is the atmosphere of a place that wasn't designed to be impressive and that has accordingly stopped trying. Vulture's Roost makes no argument for itself. It doesn't present a face to the arriving traveler. It simply exists, densely and with obvious permanence, in the particular way that places exist, when the people inside them have stopped thinking about how they look from the outside and started thinking only about what works. The structures themselves are the first evidence of this. Multiple levels rise against the sky with the architectural logic of necessity rather than plan. Sections connected by walkways that were almost certainly not part of any original blueprint. Additions built where space permitted and secured where the threat demanded. Automated defenses scan the approaches. The concentration of elite mercenaries inside the perimeter is high enough that any visitor who doesn't understand what they're entering would discover that understanding quickly and badly. This isn't a temporary encampment or a way station. It's a fortified position, deliberately maintained with enough defensive depth to make any hostile incursion a costly proposition. But fortifications are only ever the outermost layer of what a place is. The interior of Vulture's Roost is where the more complicated and more human picture develops. The bar is the center of it, not just architecturally, but socially, in the way that bars have always been the centers of communities that operate outside the reach of more formal institutions. It's a functioning space, vending machines humming with supplies, seating worn with use, the kind of atmosphere that accumulates in places where people who live hard lives gather when they're not working. The rooms nearby, accessible only with keys that require careful acquiring, serve as private quarters, locked, secured, personal, in the way that any space becomes personal when it's the only space available, when you've staked a claim to it in a place where claims are maintained by presence rather than paperwork. The contraband is distributed through the facility with the casualness of materials that have simply become part of the daily inventory, not displayed, not hidden, just there, as unremarkable as food or ammunition. What does it mean to live here? That's the question the physical reality of Vulture's Roost poses, if you're willing to sit with it rather than immediately categorize the place as simply hostile and move on. It means waking up in a locked room on a planet that no official authority claims, surrounded by people whose loyalty to you is based on the same rough logic that governs most human loyalty in conditions of scarcity and danger, shared interest, demonstrated competence, and the understanding that betrayal will cost you more than it gains. It means eating food from vending machines and doing whatever work the organization requires and waiting for the next ship to arrive with more personnel or more instructions or more supplies. It means knowing that the legal categories being applied to your existence by the distant cities have no practical force at this remove. The people who end up here arrive by various routes, but the routes seem to share certain features. Based on what we know of how Ecliptic operates and who tends to fill the ranks of private military organizations in the aftermath of large conflicts, a pattern suggests itself. Former soldiers whose skills have no civilian application, demobilized personnel whose governments made promises about reintegration that proved more expensive than anticipated, people who learned a particular set of capabilities in service of an official cause and discovered, when that cause concluded, that the capabilities were still there, but the official cause had moved on. They arrived at Ecliptic the way people arrive at most marginal organizations, because there was work and they needed it, and the work available to them at the center of the settled worlds wasn't the kind that required what they'd spent years learning to do. The ones who end up at Vulture's Roost specifically, at the organizational core, the headquarters of an operation that has moved well beyond the contractor model into something more autonomously predatory, are likely the ones for whom the drift has gone farthest. Not the most recently arrived, who might still be measuring the distance from where they started. The ones who've made a certain peace with what they are, who've stopped trying to reconcile the original justification. I'm doing this work because it's necessary, because someone has to, because the alternative is worse. With the actual conditions of daily life at a fortified outpost on a planet nobody important wanted. That's not tragedy, exactly. It's something more specific than that. The particular kind of clarity that comes when you stop measuring your position against an external standard and start measuring it only against what's actually in front of you. Whether that clarity is a liberation or a loss depends entirely on what you believe about the value of the original standard. Vulture's Roost, as a place, doesn't answer that question. It just exists in the space the question creates. Then there's the ship, a vessel from the wider Ecliptic fleet, following whatever naming convention the organization uses for its bladed weapon catalog, approaching the central landing pad at intervals to deposit personnel and supplies before departing again. It's a small logistical detail in the larger picture of the facility, but the regularity of it matters more than its individual instances. Not the single delivery of a founding expedition, not the occasional resupply of an encampment that might be pulled back when conditions shift. A cycling arrival, a steady infusion of new personnel integrating into whatever structure already exists, evidence of a supply chain and command relationship that runs from Vulture's Roost outward to some wider organizational network that someone somewhere in Ecliptic structure is actively maintaining. What the ship implies is continuity. The kind of continuity that distinguishes a headquarters from a hideout. Hideouts get abandoned when they become inconvenient, when the attention drawn by their existence outweighs the value of the refuge they provide. Headquarters are maintained because the cost of abandoning them exceeds the cost of defending them, because they've become central enough to the operation's logistics and identity that losing them would be a genuine organizational wound. Vulture's Roost, read through this lens, is not a place Ecliptic retreated to. It's a place they built toward. The material expression of a decision made at some point in the organization's drift away from legitimate contracting, that the frontier was not temporary exile, but permanent address, that the relationship between this outpost and the settled worlds has, over time, inverted itself. Jaffa 4 is home, and New Atlantis is the distant foreign country that sends occasional representatives through to conduct business they'd rather not conduct officially. The economy of Vulture's Roost is, at its core, an economy of surplus, which is to say, an economy built deliberately and intelligently on what the settled systems produced and then decided it no longer needed. This framing matters because the common characterization of scavenger economies as parasitic misses something essential about the nature of the value they're actually extracting. The colony war left behind an enormous quantity of abandoned infrastructure, outposts, manufacturing equipment, weapons stockpiles, ships in various states of disrepair, materials that had been ordered and delivered and then never used when the conflict that required them ended. From the perspective of the major powers, most of this material represented a recovery cost that exceeded its value. Too remote, too entangled with wartime ownership claims, too politically complicated to retrieve and reintegrate into official supply chains. The formal economy looked at colony war surplus and performed a calculation that said, not worth it. That calculation created value. not accidentally. It created value in a specific direction for a specific kind of actor. Someone positioned on the frontier, unburdened by the legal overhead of formal ownership claims, with the logistical capacity to move and maintain equipment in remote locations, and the willingness to trade in goods that official channels couldn't accommodate. For someone like that, colony war surplus wasn't trash. It was inventory. The same installations the UC and Freestar had walked away from represented functional assets to anyone willing to occupy them and willing to accept the risk that came with their ambiguous legal status. The contraband economy that flows through Vulture's Roost is the downstream expression of this. Contraband, it's worth remembering, is not a fixed property of any given material. It's a legal category, and like all legal categories, it exists within a jurisdiction and ceases to exist outside one. The settled worlds define contraband as the substances and materials they've decided cannot move freely through their systems for commercial reasons, political reasons, safety reasons, reasons that shift as the relevant regulations shift. But law doesn't prohibit things in a metaphysical sense. It prohibits things within the range of its enforcement. Beyond that range, the prohibition is theoretical, a rule that exists in official documents that the distant powers might invoke if they chose to invest resources in enforcement, but that exercises no practical force over daily life at Jaffa 4. The contraband at Vulture's Roost isn't smuggled once you're inside its walls. It's simply property. The people managing its storage and distribution are not thinking of themselves as criminals in the way the settled worlds would classify them. They're thinking of themselves as people who have goods and clients and a supply chain to maintain. The legal framing is the settled world's imposition, visible from the center and irrelevant at the edge. Those clients, it should be noted, are not all obviously outlaw. This is one of the more uncomfortable realities of the Vulture's Roost economy. The settled worlds have a persistent and largely unsentimental need for things they officially cannot procure. The United Colonies uses Ecliptic when deniability is operationally useful, as confirmed by their deployment of Ecliptic against the Crimson Fleet in at least one documented instance. Private interests, corporations, wealthy individuals, political actors who need particular outcomes achieved without official fingerprints form the steady background demand that makes Ecliptic financially viable. They don't appear on the supply manifest. They don't show up in the Vulture's Roost landing logs. But they're there, in the structure of the demand that keeps the place running. The Crimson Fleet's presence in the neighboring Crick system adds another dimension to this geography. Crix sits north of Jaffa on the star map, close enough to be relevant, close enough for the two organizations to be aware of each other's movements, and to have developed the kind of wary, mutually suspicious relationship that organizations sharing contested economic territory tend to develop. The fleet and Ecliptic are not allies. They are, in some senses, competitors, both operating outside official law, both commanding significant armed forces, both trading in things the settled worlds prefer not to officially acknowledge. But their models are different in a way that produces genuine friction. The Crimson Fleet built its identity around opposition. The Key, their headquarters, a former UC station seized and claimed, is a statement about what power taken from the settled worlds now belongs to. The fleet has ideological content, however chaotic and self-serving, a rejection of official authority, an embrace of the outlaw identity, a culture organized around the specific pleasure of having escaped the system that tried to contain you. Ecliptic has none of this. Their pragmatism is total. They don't reject civilization. They simply make themselves available to whoever in civilization happens to be buying. Where the fleet builds an identity around opposition, Ecliptic builds one around availability. The fleet has loyalties, however strange. Ecliptic has rates. That difference produces different kinds of places. The key is a claim, a symbol, a demonstration of what space taken from the UC can be made into. Vulture's Roost is a facility, a statement about what can be accomplished when you stop asking for permission and start asking only whether the operational calculus adds up. Both exist outside the settled world's authority, but they exist outside it differently, and the difference tells you something about the multiple ways human communities organize themselves in the absence of formal civilization's constraints. Violence in all of this is not background noise. It's infrastructure. Ecliptic's fundamental product is the credible application of force. And at Vulture's Roost, that force isn't being sold to anyone in particular. It's being maintained in reserve as capital. The automated defenses, the elite troop concentration, the fortified levels, the incoming personnel from periodically arriving ships. These aren't simply security measures. They're the material expression of the organization's core value proposition, the physical form of the thing that makes Ecliptic useful to the people who pay them and dangerous to the people who don't. The violence at Vulture's Roost isn't incidental to the economy. It is the economy, held in potential, deployed selectively, its credibility maintained by the visible and audible reality of what the place actually contains. What order looks like inside the perimeter is harder to read from the outside. The locked rooms, the key distribution, the secured contraband, these physical details suggest a social structure of some kind, some implicit understanding about what belongs to whom and who has the authority to enforce that understanding. It isn't the UC's justice, it isn't the Freestar's, but based on what those material arrangements imply, it's difficult to avoid the conclusion that the people living here have worked out something, some functional code of conduct, some hierarchy of claim that makes the place livable for the people who've chosen it. Communities without any internal order don't persist at this scale. Vulture's Roost has persisted, and persisted as a headquarters rather than an encampment. Whatever rules govern daily life inside those walls, they work well enough for the people who live by them. The thing about Vulture's Roost that ultimately stays with you, that outlasts the specific details of its layout, the precise history of Ecliptic's drift from contractor to independent predator, the particular texture of life on Jaffa 4, is what the place says about the world that exists around it. What it reflects back, whether the settled worlds want to see the reflection or not. New Atlantis presents itself as civilization's answer to everything. The UC capital is a showcase, a demonstration that human beings, given sufficient political will and sufficient resources and sufficient generations of effort, can build something genuinely worth the cost of leaving Earth and learning to breathe alien air. The white corridors of mast, the commercial districts humming with commerce, the residential towers climbing against a sky that is not quite right. All of it reads as a deliberate argument that the chaos and violence and drift of the frontier, the grief of the colony war, the disorganized human wreckage scattered across the outer systems, can be resolved into something coherent and worth having. New Atlantis is civilization's proof of concept. The UC offers it as evidence that the project is working. Neon presents a different kind of argument. The pleasure city built on Volii Alpha's ocean offers no pretense of civic virtue and makes no claims about human potential. Its origin is pharmaceutical, the discovery of Aurora and the corporation that organized its production and distribution, and its sustaining logic is commercial in the most transparent possible sense. Neon doesn't claim to be civilization's best version. It claims, with a certain honest swagger, to be civilization's actual one. Money, appetite, pleasure, all of it organized with sufficient ruthlessness and efficiency to keep the whole enterprise profitable and the lights bright. If New Atlantis is the ideal, Neon is what the ideal looks like once you've removed the civic speech making and asked only what people are actually willing to pay for. And then, neither of those things is Vulture's Roost. It doesn't argue anything. It doesn't present a vision or offer a model or make a claim about human possibility. It simply exists on the surface of Jaffa 4, in the space that New Atlantis and Neon between them have never been positioned to see. A place that was built not from ambition or from appetite, but from what was left over after ambition and appetite had taken what they needed and moved on. The question it poses to the cities that officially ignore it is deceptively simple. What is the relationship between civilization and the organizations it creates to extend itself beyond its borders? The comfortable answer, the one the settled worlds prefer, is that Vulture's Roost represents a failure. People who fell out of the system, or were pushed, or chose the wrong path at some critical juncture. Individual failures aggregated into a community of failure. That answer is useful because it makes the problem personal rather than structural. It lets the system look at itself without having to account for what it produces, for the specific ways its own logic generates the conditions that places like Vulture's Roost require in order to exist. But Ecliptic was not founded by failures. It was founded and legitimated and paid and relied upon for decades by the same civilization whose authority it has since abandoned. The people at Vulture's Roost didn't arrive there by rejecting civilization. Many of them arrived there by serving it, by doing the work that civilization needed done in places where civilization preferred not to be seen working. They were the subcontracted edge, the deniable force, the flexible capacity that a society deploying enormous power with official reluctance uses to extend that power without claiming it. They went where the UC and the Freestar Collective couldn't officially go. They did what those powers couldn't officially do, and they were paid to do it openly by governments that understood exactly what they were purchasing. The drift from that to what Ecliptic has become is not a fall from grace. It's a progression. The logic was always present. The violence was always the product. What changed was not the nature of the organization so much as the accountability structures surrounding it, and those structures were already thin when they existed at all. The question of when Ecliptic stopped being a contractor and started being something else doesn't have a clean answer, because the transition didn't involve a clear break. It involved the slow, incremental loosening of constraints that were always more nominal than real, in an environment where the cost of enforcement was consistently judged to be higher than the benefit of compliance. What Vulture's Roost holds up to the settled worlds, what it reflects from the surface of Jaffa 4 to the cities that pretend not to look, is a mirror. Not a distorted one, a clear one. It shows what the subcontracted, deniable, operationally useful parts of civilization look like when the contract expires and the deniability becomes permanent. It shows what happens to the violence when the violence stops being useful to the people who commissioned it and starts being useful only to itself. It shows what the colony war produced beyond its official casualties, the human and organizational residue that no peace treaty addressed, that no reintegration program absorbed, that both major powers had the same structural reason to quietly forget. The ruins Ecliptic occupies on Jaffa 4 are not only physical, they're the ruins of a relationship between the UC and the Freestar Collective and the organizations they created to extend their reach into space they couldn't cleanly claim, and whose reach then extended itself past all the agreed-upon limits into something neither power had intended and neither power has been willing to fully confront. New Atlantis didn't build Vulture's Roost, but it is not entirely innocent of its existence. The white corridors of Mast have a logic that produces outposts like this one as surely as demand produces supply. The distance between Alpha Centauri and Jaffa 4 is a flight of minutes. In another sense, it might as well be a political eternity, a gap maintained not by distance, but by the mutual convenience of not looking too closely at what fills the spaces official civilization can't or won't inhabit. The facility on Jaffa 4, with its bar and its locked rooms and its automated defenses and its vending machines and its elite mercenaries cleaning their weapons and waiting for the next contract, and the ships named after bladed things arriving periodically with more personnel and more supplies and more evidence that this operation is not going anywhere, is what a civilization looks like from the parts of itself it doesn't include in the official record. It's what order looks like when you follow it past its borders and keep going. It's what the subcontracted edge looks like when the subcontract ends and the edge decides to stay. The scavengers didn't come after civilization. They came out of it. They were sent ahead of it. They were used by it in the places civilization needed using done. And then, when the using was finished, when the war ended and the contracts narrowed and the grateful official acknowledgement evaporated into the particular silence that follows when powerful institutions have gotten what they needed and moved on. They were simply left in the places they'd been sent to. And they stayed. And they built. And the building over the years became something. Not the something that either great power would recognize as legitimate, not the something that any charter would have authorized or any survey mission would have recommended, but something real and permanent and unglamorous in the specific way that real permanent things often are. A place with locked rooms and a functioning bar, and ships that arrive on schedules that belong only to Ecliptic, and walls that were built from ruins by people who had stopped waiting for someone to tell them what the rules were. There's a question that Vulture's Roost poses that no amount of analyzing it fully resolves. And it's not really about Ecliptic. It's about what it costs a civilization to maintain the gap between what it officially claims to be and what it practically requires in order to remain what it is. The UC can walk its massed corridors and speak about meritocracy and the dignity of the Republic. The Freestar Collective can talk about freedom and the right of individuals to determine their own fates. Both can be speaking sincerely, and both can simultaneously be operating in the Jaffa system through the same organization, which is doing things on their behalf that they would deny under any official scrutiny. That gap doesn't close on its own, it grows. And into the growth moves everything that the official record can't contain. The violence, the people, the abandoned infrastructure, the organizations that started as tools and ended as independent powers. The gap between what civilization claims and what it requires is the space that Vulture's Roost was built in. And it is not an empty space. It never has been. The name is a kind of answer. The stars remember everything. We're just now learning what to ask.